everyone. Welcome to Encountering Scripture, a series designed to help you begin to create a personal and intimate understanding of the upcoming Sunday Scripture. Today we are on the second Sunday of Lent, and we are engaging with the Gospel of Mark still. We have spent the last, I would say, month and a half, 2 months in the Gospel of Mark, and so we're going to continue with that. And we're jumping ahead. Last week we were in Mark chapter 1. This week we're in Mark chapter 8. Reading verses 31 through 38. So as you listen to the scripture reading, I invite you to allow your imagination to take it where it wants to go, and just notice how you feel, notice thoughts that pop up, notice anything that comes into mind as you hear the scripture reading. So let's begin by reading the first reading of the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, verses 31 through 38. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter, and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." Okay, so having heard the scripture reading for the first time, I think it's important we engage with the basics. We start to place ourselves in the context of the scripture reading and know a few things about it. So the first piece I want to point out is who is present in the story. Just a basic, who are the characters that are alive in the story that we read in the moment. So we know that Jesus is present. We see that he's speaking with his disciples. He mentions the disciples, so I would assume it's the 12. And we also notice that there's a crowd of people later on halfway through the story. So it doesn't say who the crowd is made up of. It doesn't say where they're from. It just says a crowd of people. And this leads me to the second basic question, which is what just happened? What just happened? Where are we coming? Where are we coming from in this story? And you'll notice if you read for a little bit further back in chapter 8, Jesus has just been revealed to be the Messiah. So he is traveling with his disciples and he asks them who the people are saying that he is, and the disciples relate that. Then he says, "Well, who do you say I am?" And that's when we see Peter, the rock, coming forth and saying, "You are the Messiah," identifying Jesus as the Messiah. And in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus says, "Don't tell anyone." So he's keeping the Messianic secret, which we talked about a little bit before. But again, if you want to learn more about the Messianic secret, I would encourage you to Google it, because it's an important concept, especially in the Gospel of Mark. So what just happened? Jesus has just been identified by his disciples by Peter specifically, to be the Messiah. And the last point that I think is important for us to know is the location of the story, where the story is taking place. And if you read, you'll notice that we are in Caesarea Philippi. And originally, that was not its name. Originally, its name was Paneas. And Paneas was, to the Greeks, a place where they received revelation from the god Pan, who was a seer, a fortune teller, and in this location is where Pan, the Greek god, gave the Greeks revelations. And there's a cave that is located here, which is a great cave. When Alexander the Great saw this cave, he was enthralled by it. And so much so that he built a sanctuary there in this location, because the Greeks saw that this cave had a lot of water. It was so much water that they couldn't measure it. And actually the water in this cave is what feeds the Jordan River. And so the Greeks believed that where there was that amount of water, then it was actually a dwelling place for the gods. And in this particular case, it was the god Pan. And so Alexander the Great built a sanctuary to Pan for it. And that's why you get the name Paneas as the city. And then under Roman rule, you see after Herod the Great dies, so Herod the Great was the original Herod who died in the year 4 BC. After he died, his kingdom, which was encompassed all of the ancient Mediterranean, they broke it up into 3 parts, and his sons took over. And his son Philip took over this section of Herod the Great's territory. And so when he got power, he built another sanctuary, another shrine, another sanctuary on the site by the cave, and he renamed the area Caesarea Philippi. And he did this as an honor to Caesar Tiberius. So Caesarea is meaning Caesar, and then Philippi was in honor of himself, Philip. So you see, it's a very self-serving renaming, but it's a site of Roman rule as well as the rule of Herod. And also, don't forget that the Gospel of Mark is written in the year anywhere from 68 to 72, which is during the Jewish War, during the revolt against the Jewish authorities and the revolt against Roman occupation. So I think there's a strategic location by the writer of the Gospel of Mark in locating it here in Caesarea Philippi. So now I'd like us to dig in a little bit into the scripture, go a little bit deeper into the scripture. And for this, I have 2 questions for us. And the first question I would like to bring up is, what is the difference between human and divine things? What is the difference between human and divine things? And so we see this dichotomy that's set up by Jesus as he speaks with Peter in verse 33. And if we go back and read that, you'll see that in verse 33, Jesus says, "But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, 'Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things.'" You are setting your mind not on divine things, but human things. And so I go back to my question, what's the difference between human and divine things? I invite you to do some research on your own and think about this dichotomy, because I think it's very important and when we enter into our second question. And I would invite you to go back to the wilderness stories. Go back to the story of Jesus' temptation, because I think there's a lot of interplay here, and I think we can learn a lot about what Jesus determines as being human and what Jesus determines as being divine. And if we go back to the stories of the temptations in the wilderness, you'll see that they take place, and you might want to mark this down, in Matthew 4, 1 through 11, Mark 1, 12 and 13. Mark is just a short capturing of the wilderness. And then finally you have Luke 4, 1 through 13. Those are where we really see, especially Matthew and Luke, is where we see what happens to Jesus in the wilderness, the temptations that Jesus undergoes. And you'll see, I think it's interesting when you think about what's the difference between human and divine things. And when you think of Satan, Jesus identifying Peter as Satan, why does he do that? What is it about what Peter says that gives Jesus the ability to compare him or call him Satan? And so when we go back to the wilderness, I think there's some very important and revealing things we can learn about this. But I want you to do your work on this. I invite you to really think about the difference between human and divine things. And that's going to lead us into our second question, which is, what is Jesus' understanding or definition of life? What is Jesus' understanding or definition of life? And this goes back to verse 35, when Jesus sets up another interesting dichotomy, another interesting kind of sidebar, where he says, "For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who want to lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it." So how does Jesus understand life? And I think going back to that question of the difference between human and divine things will feed into this answer. And so I think it's important for us to really think about and try to articulate for ourselves how we see Jesus understanding, how Jesus understands life, what life is, and what life should be. And I think once we understand that, I think our understanding of this whole scripture will come to life, and it will change our own lives as we live it in the world now. And so maybe a good exercise for you to do is to go dig in a little bit to how Jesus understands life, and then articulate for yourself, what does life mean to you? What does life mean to you? And then see what's similar and what's different between your two understandings. Maybe it could be a good spiritual exercise to think about if you've created Jesus and to be someone like you, or if you are creating yourself to be like Jesus. I think that's a good comparison and a contrast to see how you are developing spiritually. Because then Jesus talks about hard things that we are going to have to do as followers of Christ. Bear your cross. Those who want to follow Jesus must bear your cross, must take up our cross and follow him. Again, crosses where it was a sign of a gruesome death. It was a sign of immense pain. And not only that, but very... it was a defaming process where the people are stripped of their humanity. And so Jesus is making a very big point right here. And I think when we understand the difference between human things and divine things, when we understand how Jesus understands life, I think it'll make this scripture really come alive in a different way. I also think that it will challenge us as we walk in this world as followers of Christ. I think it'll start to affect how we do that. So I encourage you to ask these two questions again. What is the difference between human and divine things? And the second question is, what is Jesus' understanding or definition of life? So I invite you to dive into those two questions this week. And as you do that, really take notes, really pray, really think about it in some deep, deep ways. And now, having posed these two questions, after having gone through some of the basics, after having understood it a little bit, just kind of set our mindset into understanding the scripture, I invite you to hear the second reading of this scripture, and do it just completely open. Allow your mind to empty and just hear the story and listen, and allow your mind to take you where it wants to go. So here, Mark 8:31 through 38. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." After having heard this final reading of the scripture, if anything popped out for you, if there was any vibrant images or words that stuck out, or any phrases or anything that was really vibrant that came up for you as you heard or read this story, I invite you to mark those down, write those down, or take a mental note of them so that you can come back to them and maybe follow those visions, those words down a rabbit hole, so that might bring to life this scripture. But I hope that these two questions, this going over the basics, will help you start on your process of understanding the scripture, making it real for your life. Because remember, the purpose of the gospel is not to understand every historical minute detail, but it's to make your life better. It's to make your life more engaged, to allow you to become more in communion with God on an everyday level. So I invite you to go on this trek, go on this journey, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me, and I look forward to joining you on Sunday. So thank you. I'm praying for you, and I look forward to seeing you on Sunday.